Chapter 1. The Discovery. Mr. Whiskers, an elegant, sleek black cat with a penchant for mischief and a thirst for power, was sunbathing on the windowsill of his owner's small apartment. He enjoyed the warm sun rays as they caressed his fur, but his mind was always plotting and scheming. He lived with his owner, Susan, and his unlikely companion, Barkley, a lovable and incredibly clumsy golden retriever. Their apartment was cozy, filled with an eclectic mix of furniture and knickknacks that Susan had collected over the years. The walls were adorned with various pieces of art, some abstract and others depicting serene landscapes. The small living room was the heart of the apartment, and it was here that Barkley and Mr. Whiskers spent most of their time when they weren't busy plotting or inadvertently saving the world, respectively. As Mr. Whiskers basked in the sunlight, his emerald green eyes fell upon a newspaper Susan had left on the coffee table. The headline caught his attention: "Ancient Egyptian Artifact Arrives at City Museum." His ears perked up with curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder if this artifact held the key to the power he so desperately craved. Over the next few days, Mr. Whiskers became increasingly obsessed with the mysterious artifact. He spent hours studying it on Susan's computer, devouring every bit of information he could find. He learned that the artifact was believed to be a relic from the time of the pharaohs and was rumored to possess immense power. This was exactly the kind of thing Mr. Whiskers looking for a tool to help him achieve his ultimate goal of world domination. Meanwhile, Barkley was blissfully unaware of Mr. Whiskers' nefarious plans. He spent his days wagging his tail, chasing after his favorite squeaky toy, and occasionally bumping into furniture. Barkley was the epitome of joy and innocence, completely oblivious to Mr. Whiskers' machinations. As Mr. Whiskers continued his research, he began to formulate a plan to steal the artifact from the museum. He knew he had to be careful not to arouse suspicion, especially from Susan or Barkley. He studied the museum's security system, taking note of the surveillance cameras, motion detectors, and alarm system. He began to piece together a masterful plan that would allow him to slip in and out of the museum undetected, taking the ancient Egyptian artifact with him. While Mr. Whiskers was hatching his plan, Barkley couldn't help but notice that something was amiss. His feline friend was spending an unusual amount of time on the computer, and seemed more distant than usual. Barkley couldn't put his paw on it, but he knew something was up, despite his innate clumsiness and lack of intellectual prowess. Barkley was incredibly perceptive and had a knack for sensing when something was wrong. He made a silent promise to himself to keep a close eye on Mr. Whiskers and to make sure his friend didn't get into any trouble. Chapter 2. The Preparation. As Mr. Whiskers delved deeper into his research, he discovered that the ancient Egyptian artifact was a small, intricately carved amulet. The amulet was said to have once belonged to a powerful sorcerer who served the pharaohs. This sorcerer, known as Thoth Amun, was rumored to have been granted immense powers by the gods themselves, enabling him to manipulate the elements, control the minds of others, and even bend time and space to his will. The secret to these powers was believed to be embedded within the very amulet that now rested within the city museum. As Mr. Whiskers read about the extraordinary abilities the amulet could bestow upon its wielder, he couldn't help but imagine the endless possibilities that would open up for him. With such power at his disposal, he could effortlessly conquer the world, bending it to his will and reshaping it as he saw fit. He could command armies, control the minds of world leaders, and manipulate the forces of nature to bring about his vision of a cat-ruled world. Driven by this desire for ultimate power, Mr. Whiskers became even more determined to steal the amulet from the city museum. He knew that possessing the amulet would change everything for him, catapulting him from a mere house cat to a force to be reckoned with. With his plan carefully crafted, Mr. Whiskers set out to gather the necessary tools and disguises for the heist. He began by fashioning a makeshift grappling hook out of a coat hanger and some string. Next, he repurposed a small backpack Susan used for her makeup, intending to use it to carry the artifact out of the museum. To ensure he could see in the dark, Mr. Whiskers borrowed a small flashlight, securing it to his head with a piece of elastic. As the day of the heist approached, Mr. Whiskers spent his time perfecting his disguise. He crafted a tiny mask from black fabric, which would both conceal his identity and blend in with his dark fur. He even practiced walking on his hind legs to imitate the gait of a human, hoping to go unnoticed by the museum's security cameras. Meanwhile, Barkley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He watched Mr. Whiskers from a distance, puzzled by his friend's strange behavior. Barkley noticed the small grappling hook, the backpack, and the tiny mask, but couldn't quite piece together what Mr. Whiskers was planning. Despite his confusion, Barkley was determined to find out what his friend was up to and to make sure he didn't get into any trouble. Over the course of several days leading up to the heist, Mr. Whiskers meticulously studied the museum's security system. He had managed to obtain a copy of the blueprints and used them to analyze every inch of the building. He spent hours poring over the schematics, noting the locations of security cameras, motion detectors, and alarm triggers. He even went so far as to observe the museum guards from a distance, learning their patrol routes and shift changes. Mr. Whiskers knew that knowledge was power, and he was determined to arm himself with as much information as possible. He made a detailed list of potential weaknesses and blind spots in the security system, devising a plan that would allow him to exploit these vulnerabilities to his advantage. He practiced the route he would take through the museum, mentally visualizing each step to ensure that he could navigate the building with ease and precision. In addition to his thorough examination of the security system, Mr. Whiskers also dedicated a significant amount of time to memorizing the layout of the museum. He was particularly interested in the Egyptian exhibit, where the artifact would be displayed. He knew that this room would likely have heightened security measures, and he needed to be prepared to face any additional obstacles that might stand in his way. Mr. Whiskers created a scaled model of the museum from cardboard, carefully crafting each room and hallway to match the blueprints he had obtained. He placed tiny replicas of the security cameras and motion detectors in their respective positions, using this miniature museum to practice his planned route and rehearse his every move. As the days passed and his preparations continued, Mr. Whiskers grew increasingly confident in his ability to pull off the heist. He knew that he had only one chance to succeed, and he couldn't afford any mistakes. With every hour spent studying, practicing, and refining his plan, Mr. Whiskers became more and more certain that he was ready to face the challenges that awaited him at the City Museum. Despite his extensive preparations, Mr. Whiskers couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Barkley's clumsy nature might somehow interfere with his plan. He tried to dismiss these concerns, reminding himself that Barkley would likely remain blissfully unaware of his true intentions. Nevertheless, as the night of the heist approached, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but wonder whether Barkley's inherent clumsiness might prove to be an unexpected and unwelcome wildcard in his carefully crafted scheme. Chapter 3: The Night of the Heist. As the long-awaited night of the heist finally arrived, Mr. Whiskers could feel a mixture of excitement and anxiety coursing through his veins. He knew that this was the moment he had been working towards, and he couldn't afford to let any doubts or fears cloud his mind. With a determined glint in his eye, Mr. Whiskers donned his mask, the fabric fitting snugly around his face and concealing his true identity. He checked the small flashlight he had secured to his head, ensuring that it was positioned just right to illuminate his path, without drawing unwanted attention. Satisfied with his preparations, he turned his attention to the grappling hook and backpack, which he had carefully tucked into a corner of the living room. As Mr. Whiskers approached the makeshift stash, he paused for a moment to double-check the contents of the backpack. Inside, he had stored a few additional tools that he believed might come in handy during the heist, such as a small set of lockpicks and a collapsible rod that could be used to trip any hidden pressure-sensitive alarms. Convinced that he had everything he needed, Mr. Whiskers zipped up the backpack and slung it over his shoulder, the weight of the tools providing a comforting reminder of his meticulous planning. With all his gear in place, Mr. Whiskers cast one final glance at the sleeping Barkley, who lay sprawled on his dog bed, blissfully unaware of the adventure that was about to unfold. Despite his best efforts to suppress his concern, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but worry about the potential consequences of Barkley's inherent clumsiness. He silently hoped that Barkley would remain asleep and undisturbed, allowing him to carry out his plan without interference. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Mr. Whiskers approached the window and skillfully slid it open, the cool night air gently ruffling his fur. He took one last look around the familiar apartment before slipping through the window and onto the fire escape, the metal grating cold beneath his paws. With his heart pounding in his chest, Mr. Whiskers began his journey to the city museum, each step bringing him closer to the ancient artifact and the unimaginable power that awaited him. As Mr. Whiskers made his way across the city, he carefully navigated the shadowy alleyways and quiet streets, avoiding the pools of light cast by the street lamps. His years of experience as a cunning feline allowed him to move silently and stealthily, leaving no trace of his presence. The city that had seemed so familiar and ordinary during the day now took on an entirely different atmosphere at night, the darkness transforming it into a mysterious and thrilling playground for his daring escapade. Before long, the imposing silhouette of the city museum loomed in the distance, its grand facade casting an imposing shadow over the surrounding area. Mr. Whiskers could feel a tingling sensation in his paws as he approached the building, the anticipation of the heist making his whiskers twitch with excitement. Recalling his memorized route, Mr. Whiskers scaled the museum's outer wall, the grappling hook securing his ascent as he climbed with agility and grace. Once he reached the roof, he carefully scanned the area for any signs of security or surveillance. Finding none, he cautiously approached the ventilation shaft he had identified during his planning, the soft hum of the air conditioning system providing a reassuring reminder of the building's layout. With a quiet sigh of relief, Mr. Whiskers removed the vent cover and slipped inside, the narrow passage providing just enough room for him to crawl through. He navigated the maze of ducts with ease, the blueprints he had studied so extensively guiding him through the dark and twisting corridors. As he crawled, he couldn't help but think about Barkley and wonder if his canine companion had awakened from his slumber. He pushed these thoughts to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. At last, Mr. Whiskers emerged from the ventilation system into the Egyptian exhibit, the dim security lighting casting eerie shadows across the ancient artifacts. He surveyed the room with a calculating eye, noting the positions of the cameras and motion detectors before beginning his approach. As he crept closer to the display case containing the ancient artifact, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but marvel at the power he believed it held. He imagined himself wielding that power, using it to shape the world in his image and bend it to his will. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew that he had to succeed at all costs. With a steady paw, Mr. Whiskers began to disable the security measures surrounding the artifact, his lockpicks and collapsible rod expertly navigating the web of traps and alarms. It was only a matter of time before the artifact would be his, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at his own cunning and resourcefulness. However, unbeknownst to Mr. Whiskers, Barkley had indeed awakened from his sleep, and, noticing the absence of his feline friend, had set off in search of him. As the lovable and clumsy dog stumbled into the museum, he inadvertently set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the unraveling of Mr. Whiskers' carefully crafted plan. Chapter 4: Barkley to the Rescue. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Barkley had awakened to the unsettling silence permeated the room. His keen sense of smell immediately detected the lingering scent of Mr. Whiskers, and he knew that his feline friend was no longer in the apartment. Concerned for Mr. Whiskers' safety, Barkley resolved to track him down and ensure he was all right. Barkley bounded out the window and onto the fire escape, clumsily navigating the metal stairs as he followed the faint trail of Mr. Whiskers' scent. His tail wagged excitedly as he traversed the city streets, the exhilaration of his adventure temporarily outweighing his concern for his friend. Eventually, Barkley's nose led him to the museum, its grand exterior beckoning him to explore its darkened halls. With a nudge of his snout, Barkley managed to squeeze through a slightly ajar service door, blissfully unaware of the chaos his entrance would soon create. Back in the Egyptian exhibit, Mr. Whiskers had almost completed the disarmament of the security system. His whiskers quivered with anticipation as he prepared to claim his prize. Just as he reached out to grasp the ancient artifact, a cacophony of noise erupted from the entrance of the museum. In his excitement, Barkley had inadvertently knocked over a priceless vase in the hallway, the sound of shattering porcelain echoing throughout the museum. The sudden noise caused Mr. Whiskers to jump, his paw colliding with the display case and setting off the very alarm he had tried so hard to avoid. Chapter 5: The Great Escape. Red lights flashed and sirens blared as Mr. Whiskers looked on in horror, his heart sinking as he realized that his carefully laid plan was falling apart before his eyes. As he frantically searched for a way out, he spotted Barkley bounding into the exhibit, his goofy grin and wagging tail a stark contrast to the seriousness of the situation. "Barkley!" Mr. Whiskers hissed, equal parts relieved and infuriated by the appearance of his canine companion. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," Barkley replied cheerfully, oblivious to the chaos he had caused. "I woke up, and you were gone, and I just knew something was wrong." Mr. Whiskers didn't have time to scold Barkley for his clumsiness, as the sound of approaching security guards reached their ears. Knowing they had to act quickly, Mr. Whiskers abandoned his pursuit of the artifact and focused instead on finding a way to escape. With Barkley close at his heels, Mr. Whiskers darted through the museum, his knowledge of the building's layout aiding their escape. They narrowly avoided capture at every turn, their hearts pounding in their chests as they desperately sought a way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst through a side door and into the cool night air. As they sprinted through the shadows and back towards the safety of their apartment, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but feel a mixture of frustration and relief. While he had failed in his quest for the ancient artifact and the power it promised, he and Barkley had managed to escape unscathed. Chapter 6: The Aftermath and the Bath. Back at the apartment, the two friends collapsed onto the floor, exhausted from their harrowing adventure. As they caught their breath, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but notice the dirt and grime that now coated his once pristine fur. He sighed in resignation, knowing that Susan would insist on giving him a bath as soon as she discovered his filthy state. As Mr. Whiskers begrudgingly accepted his fate, he couldn't help but admit, if only to himself, that despite the disastrous outcome of his plan, there was a small part of him that was grateful for Barkley's presence. The loyal and goofy dog had, in his own unintentional way, saved Mr. Whiskers from a potentially dangerous situation. While Mr. Whiskers would never openly admit it, he knew that Barkley's actions had been driven by a genuine concern for his well-being. With their adventure behind them, Mr. Whiskers and Barkley spent the remainder of the night resting, their bodies sprawled out on the living room floor. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the apartment windows, Susan returned home, her expression a mixture of surprise and exasperation as she surveyed the disheveled state of her pets. "What on earth have you two been up to?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. As she approached Mr. Whiskers, her nose wrinkled in distaste at the sight and smell of his dirty fur. "Mr. Whiskers, you're filthy. It looks like you'll be needing a bath." Mr. Whiskers groaned inwardly at the prospect of another humiliating bath. But he knew there was no escaping it, as Susan scooped him up and carried him towards the bathroom. He shot Barkley a look that was equal parts annoyance and gratitude. Barkley, for his part, simply wagged his tail and offered Mr. Whiskers a goofy grin in return. While Mr. Whiskers endured his bath, Susan playfully splashing water on his indignant face, he couldn't help but think about the events of the previous night. His plan to harness the power of the ancient artifact had been foiled, but he couldn't deny that the adventure had been thrilling. And as much as he hated to admit it, he knew that Barkley had played a crucial role in their escape. As the warm water washed away the dirt and grime from his fur, Mr. Whiskers begrudgingly accepted that Barkley, despite his clumsiness and lack of cunning, was a valuable ally. And while he knew that his dreams of world conquest were far from over, he also knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he could always rely on Barkley to be by his side, ready to face whatever adventures awaited them. As Susan finished bathing Mr. Whiskers, she couldn't help but smile at the sight of her two beloved pets, their bond stronger than ever despite their differences. And as the sun rose on another day in their small apartment, Mr. Whiskers and Barkley settled in to enjoy a well-earned rest, their minds already beginning to dream up their next thrilling escapade.